The old king had passed many restless nights pondering the future of his realm. King Viserys I Targaryen, though gentle by nature, had been plagued by nightmares that rattled the peace he so desperately wished to preserve. The weight of the crown lay heavy upon his brow, for he knew the day would come when his beloved daughter Rhaenyra and his son by a later marriage, Aegon, might come to dread conflict. Yet in those feverish dreams that robbed him of proper slumber, he saw a path forward, a union that might avert disaster and stall the uncertain days he believed loomed over House Targaryen. And so he wrestled with the idea, a notion that seemed as inevitable as it was unsettling. To wed Rhaenyra Targaryen, the realm's delight, to her half-brother, Aegon Targaryen. If the ancient Valyrian traditions were to stand for anything, then such a match might be the surest way to fuse the Greens and the Blacks into a single force, united by both blood and marriage. Viserys often sighed when he considered how precarious a solution it was, but it was, in his weary view, the only one that could knit together the fractures forming in his beloved family. He had labored for many a year to keep the peace. His realm was prosperous and mostly content, but gossip traveled quickly through the Red Keep's courtyards, whispering through hallways hung with crimson and black banners. Everyone knew that Alicent Hightower, the king's second wife, had ambitions for her children. Everyone also knew that Rhaenyra's claim to the throne had always been dear to Viserys' heart. Over the years, the court separated into two camps, those whose hearts belonged to the princess's cause, and those loyal to the queen and her brood of sons. Though outright violence was yet to erupt, Viserys recognized the seeds of discord for what they were. A single spark could ignite a blaze that might burn away the foundations of Targaryen rule. Late one evening, as a thick fog of smoke curled from the brazier in his solar, King Viserys found himself at the painted table, the very one built in the shape of Westeros, carved with mountain ridges and river valleys. His wife, Queen Alicent, stood at his side. She was robed in the deep green colors that had come to represent her faction, an irony not lost on anyone who saw her in the corridors. Alicent was no naive maiden. She understood the precariousness of the situation every bit as sharply as her husband did. Her eyes flicked over the wooden hills and painted seas. She tried to picture Rhaenyra's supporters, lords and ladies who had sworn fealty to the princess in the early days, and balanced them against the lords who would stand for her children, Aegon especially, a boy she considered destined for greatness if only he could be given the chance to prove himself. When Viserys finally turned to address her, a hush fell in the solar that even the night candles honored. "My queen," he murmured, his voice heavy with foreboding. "I fear we can no longer ignore the rift within our house. There must be a union, a forging of the blood, to secure our line. The princess must wed her half-brother." Alicent did not blink. Though this was not entirely unexpected, Valyrian tradition sometimes demanded siblings wed. The notion held an electric charge. The queen's breathing grew slightly uneven, but her composure remained otherwise unshaken. She thought of her son, golden-haired, spirited, but also filled with the arrogance of youth and the entitlement of a boy who believed he was the true heir. She also thought of Rhaenyra, formidable and proud, who wore her father's favor like a cloak of starlight. Would the princess accept such a match? In the tradition of their house she might, but the heart was another matter. Alicent stared at Viserys in silence for a time, letting the gravity of it wash over her. Viserys, weary as he was, pressed on. "I have decided that Rhaenyra shall marry Aegon. It will preserve the peace. It will unify our claim. It will forestall war. Let the realm see that our house is one. After I pass, there will be no question of succession, no cause for bloodshed. They will stand together as king and queen, each supporting the other. Let those who wear black and those who wear green set aside their garments and clothe themselves in Targaryen red." Though she nodded, Alicent's thoughts churned. She had fought too fiercely for her son to see him overshadowed. If Rhaenyra were to be queen in her own right, would Aegon linger as some consort, overshadowed by a stronger personality? Alicent prayed that if the match was to happen, the realm would receive it with fewer misgivings than she currently harbored. Yet she also recognized that it might be the best outcome. Aegon's path to kingship, ironically, might be easiest through Rhaenyra herself. So she gave her husband a measured bow of the head and replied, "As you command, my king." When Rhaenyra was informed, her eyes flared with a mixture of surprise and a pang of betrayal. She had grown up believing she would be the one to sit upon the Iron Throne, unchallenged, by right of her father's explicit naming of her as his heir. Yet she had also been raised in the old Targaryen tradition, aware that sibling marriages were not so unusual in the history of her forebears. Only time would tell whether this arrangement was a cunning stroke of political genius or the forging of an uneasy union that would bring endless friction within House Targaryen. Once the shock subsided, she found the logic undeniable. A single line of succession, children of both the Blacks and the Greens in one cradle. She thought of her own heritage, the prophecy her father had once whispered to her about the prince who was promised, about a song of ice and fire. Could it be that forging unity between her line and Aegon's would be part of ensuring that fabled destiny? In the following days, the entire court seemed to exist in a hush of wary anticipation. Everywhere Rhaenyra walked in the Red Keep, she felt the weight of eyes on her, the curious or suspicious stares of courtiers who had, until now, expected conflict. The princess was no longer a child. She was grown into a woman of fierce bearing and quick wit. It was said she had some of her Uncle Daemon's boldness, though tempered by a sense of duty that, most days, kept her from acting purely on impulse. As she navigated the labyrinth of passageways and the new labyrinth of expectations, she told herself that she did this for her father. Viserys was aging more rapidly these days, his health never as robust as it once was. To stand in open defiance of his plan would be a cruelty. For his part, Aegon, younger than Rhaenyra by several years, displayed a mixture of smugness and apprehension. He recognized that his mother had always groomed him for greatness, and he had come to believe he was more fit to rule than his elder sister. Now, to be wed to her, she who had always been half an enemy in his mind, triggered a churning of pride and uncertainty in the boy. Aegon was used to deference from his siblings and attention from the lords who believed in his claim, yet here was Rhaenyra, older, more experienced in the ways of court, favored by the king. Their betrothal felt like both an elevation and a tether. He swung between delight at the notion that he would be king alongside her and a lingering resentment that she had been declared heir before he was even born. But if he was honest with himself, the notion of a wedding might pave a less tumultuous path than a civil war, and even as a boy with a proud spirit, he was not blind to the allure of avoiding a bloody conflict. Dragons at war meant tragedy for all. It was Prince Daemon Targaryen, the king's notorious brother, who cast the longest shadow upon this impending betrothal. Daemon was known for his cunning, his ferocity, and the potent hold he seemed to have on Rhaenyra's affections. While in some versions of rumor he was a mentor and dear confidant, in others he was a corrupting influence, leading Rhaenyra astray with his violent temperament and bold disregard for tradition. When he learned that Rhaenyra was to wed young Aegon, his laughter echoed through the halls. The gold cloaks he commanded in the city watch muttered that the prince found it all too amusing. Though Daemon never spoke openly against the plan, those who knew him saw a coiling tension in his posture, a readiness for confrontation that suggested he was waiting for the right moment to reveal his stance. Yet Daemon never dared to cross Viserys directly, not since his own exile and subsequent return to grace. Rumors abounded that if Daemon had his way, he might have taken Rhaenyra to wife himself, a tradition not unheard of in Valyrian custom. But with Viserys' decree, Rhaenyra was to be Aegon's, cementing the line of succession in a single branch. As ravens flitted across the 7 kingdoms to bear the announcement, lords far and wide reacted with diverse emotions. Some, particularly in the Reach and the Vale, sent back cautious blessings, for they believed in the authority of King Viserys to handle his own family. Others were not so easily persuaded. In the north, many remembered the old ways, yet Ned Stark's ancestors in Winterfell tended to place more weight on male primogeniture. They watched with an uneasy acceptance. Still others whispered that a forced marriage would never unify hearts and minds, that this was a patch over a gaping wound. The matter of loyalty ran deeper than a marriage contract, after all. In the Stepstones, those who had seen Daemon Targaryen's bold campaigns questioned whether the realm might soon need a war leader more than a peace broker. The succession had never been a trifling matter, and the realm's curiosity was aflame at the prospect of Rhaenyra and Aegon forging a single path. At the Red Keep, preparations for the betrothal ceremony began in earnest. Seamstresses labored over Rhaenyra's gown, weaving dragon motifs in gold thread. The banquet halls were transformed by flickering torches, fresh rushes on the floors, and banners of house sigils from all corners of the kingdom. Knights practicing in the yard took on a renewed energy, eager to show their prowess in the grand tournaments that would likely accompany the wedding. Musicians tuned their instruments, and casks of Dornish wine were rolled out. Servants whispered rumors. Would the princess find happiness in such a union? Would Aegon's mother overshadow Rhaenyra's influence in the marriage? Courtiers lined up to offer tidings of joy, each trying to conceal the swirl of tension that roiled beneath the surface. No matter how bright the festivities, no matter how skilled the performers, everyone sensed that this was more than just a royal wedding. It was a gamble with the kingdom's destiny. Everyone prayed it would pay off. Days crawled forward like a slow tide, and soon the day of the official betrothal feast arrived. The sun was bright in the sky, a seeming blessing from the father and the warrior and all the gods who oversaw matters of state and family. The great hall was filled with the scent of roasted boar, spiced honey cakes, and sweet wines. Lords in fine velvets and satins crowded around, and ladies in their richest gowns vied for the closest view of the royal dais. The hall was an ocean of color. The green of House Hightower blended with the black and red of Targaryen might. Hushed murmurs rose as the herald announced the arrival of King Viserys, walking slowly but regally, with the queen on his arm. Behind them came Princess Rhaenyra, radiant in a black dress that shimmered with red embroidery, her long pale hair arranged in intricate braids that framed her face. She carried herself with the regal bearing of one long accustomed to the gaze of courtiers, but those close enough could see the flicker of doubt in her dark violet eyes. Prince Aegon entered afterward, wearing black as well, his golden locks brushed back, and the smallest flicker of a smirk at the corner of his lips. This was his moment too, and he meant to savor it. The onlookers might have been forgiven for thinking they saw a prince and princess who could be the realm's future, united at last in a demonstration of Targaryen power. King Viserys spoke, the great hall silencing like a windless night. He declared that, by the laws of their house and with the blessings of the faith, Princess Rhaenyra was to be betrothed to Prince Aegon. Viserys called upon the realm to witness the union of the two claimants, an act meant to bind the bloodline and keep peace in the land. Trumpets echoed, guests applauded, and loyal lords cried out their approval in formal, courteous phrases. Yet beneath the music and cheers, a tension so thick it could be tasted lingered. Rhaenyra's sworn supporters forced smiles, some glancing warily at Alicent Hightower, who observed all with a pristine, unmoving calm. Aegon's close companions hollered in triumph as though he had won some great victory. At the dais, Rhaenyra and Aegon exchanged the expected pleasantries. He bowed low, she curtsied in kind, and their hands touched in a gesture that might have been tender if not for the forced courtesy that shaped it. When King Viserys called for a feast, the tables groaned under rich platters of roast swan, honeyed ham, and fruit from the arbor. Servants hurried to fill the wine cups, musicians struck up lively melodies, and dancers began to take to the floor. People laughed, sang, and drank to the health of the betrothed couple. In a display of Valyrian heritage, several lesser Targaryen cousins arrived wearing silver-blonde wigs even if their own hair was darker, wanting to appear closer to the main line. Courtiers wearing pins shaped like dragons roamed about, excitedly greeting one another. To an outsider, the whole celebration seemed joyous. It was only those who had spent years in the Red Keep who sensed the fragile peace, as though they were feasting upon thin ice that might crack at any moment. Daemon was present, of course. He wore black leather and rubies at his collar. He observed the proceedings with eyes that glinted like polished obsidian. While others danced, he remained at the fringes, swirling his wine in a metal goblet, exchanging few words. Now and again, his gaze would fix on Rhaenyra, and those who caught the look murmured that it was a gaze of regret, longing, or possibly calculation. He seemed to measure Aegon from across the hall, as though weighing up what sort of man could keep Rhaenyra enthralled or subdued. For Daemon, the question of who should sit the Iron Throne was never a question at all. Rhaenyra was the rightful heir. He had half a mind to ensure nothing stood in her way, but a union with Aegon might complicate everything. Still, the king had decreed it, and Daemon knew better than to raise an open protest against his brother now. Rhaenyra herself struggled with a swirl of emotions. She could hardly deny that Aegon had a certain charm about him, a confidence that sometimes gleamed in his eye. But she saw him also as a symbol of the queen's ambitions, a reminder that in another life, he might have challenged her openly for the throne. Now that her father had bound them together in matrimony, perhaps that challenge would be muted, or perhaps it would resurface in a different form altogether. As the night wore on and the dancers changed from lively reels to slow, stately steps, she found herself dancing with Aegon under the watchful gaze of hundreds. He held her with a careful grip, trying not to betray his own inexperience or the lingering wariness that underpinned his every move. The swirl of their dark garments, black upon black, seemed to merge them into a single silhouette under the torches. Overhead, the Targaryen banners with their three-headed dragons flapped gently in the drafty hall, as though the dragons themselves were uncertain of what to make of this union. At the feast's end, Viserys rose once more, calling for a toast. He reminded everyone of their oaths to House Targaryen, thanked them for bearing witness, and prayed that the gods would bless Rhaenyra and Aegon's future with strong heirs and wise governance. The hall exploded in applause, though many a pair of eyes flicked to Daemon, to Alicent, and to the princess's sworn favorites to see how they reacted. Daemon remained stoic, Queen Alicent's smile was demure, and Rhaenyra's faithful knights wore wooden expressions that revealed nothing. The tension lingered, subtle as a knife's edge. This was a grand gesture, but for some it felt like an elaborate performance. In any case, the betrothal was sealed. Not long after, the date for the wedding was set for the coming turn of the moon. The king would not risk waiting longer lest second thoughts bloom into sabotage or rebellion. As the day approached, ravens flew to Dragonstone and Storm's End, to Casterly Rock, Highgarden, Winterfell, and the Twins, calling lords and ladies from every corner of Westeros to witness the union. The labyrinth of alliances that bound the Seven Kingdoms meant that this wedding was not just a private affair, but a grand stage for House Targaryen to display its might, wealth, and stability. The realm needed reassurance that the days of a single, uncontested monarchy were not over. Viserys was determined to show them that House Targaryen remained strong as dragonfire. On the morning of the wedding, King's Landing was abuzz with activity. Vendors set up stalls along the city's winding streets, selling miniature dragon figurines, ribbons of black, green, and red, and sweet treats shaped like dragon eggs. The small folk murmured about the possibility of seeing two Targaryens on dragonback, or hearing the echoing roars in the sky if the prince and princess chose to take flight. For all their daily hardships, weddings in the royal family offered a spectacle that broke the monotony of survival. At the Red Keep, guests poured in, high towers in their green finery, Valerians with silver hair streaming, lords from Dorne in flowing silks, Northmen in heavy cloaks, and even envoys from the free cities, curious about what alliances might shift. The great hall was cleared for the ceremony, set with benches lined to face the dais where the High Septon would conduct the rites. Soldiers of the Kingsguard stood at every entrance, their white armor gleaming, ensuring that no threat could approach. Rhaenyra prepared in her chambers, assisted by trusted ladies who pinned her hair up in an elaborate style that displayed her Valyrian features in full glory. Her gown was black with threads of gold, embroidered with the three-headed dragon, 2 heads black, 1 green, in a symbolic attempt to blend the houses Targaryen and Hightower. She stared at her reflection in an ornate mirror framed with swirling dragons. This was not the marriage she had once imagined, but she told herself again that this was for the good of the realm, for her father's sake. She could not bear to see Viserys' health decline further under the weight of unresolved conflict. She thought of her children yet unborn, who would unify the bloodlines. Would they be strong, or would the seeds of strife remain, poisoning the next generation? Meanwhile, Prince Aegon paced in his own suite, receiving final touches from a host of attendants. He wore black as well, with a golden belt set with rubies. A regal half-cloak draped over one shoulder, fastened by a brooch in the shape of a roaring dragon. He had little taste for the careful ceremony of it all. He wanted to get on with the wedding feast, the wine, and the potential carousing afterward. The significance of this marriage was not lost on him, but part of him remained a boy wanting to show off. He caught a glimpse of himself in a polished shield propped against the wall, golden hair, aquiline nose, the confident tilt of his chin, and wondered if Rhaenyra would be moved by him at all. He reminded himself that Targaryen tradition sometimes called for sibling matches. This was nothing new, he insisted in his own mind. It would be no different from the many historic unions that had shaped the family line since Valyria. Yet the pit in his stomach told him otherwise. This was not just about him or Rhaenyra. It was about power, legacy, and the entire realm's future. At midday, bells tolled from the sept within the Red Keep, summoning the guests. They filed in, men in their finery, ladies in glittering jewels, forming two sections that symbolized their prior affiliations. Yet, ideally, these affiliations were to merge by the end of the ceremony. Viserys entered first, walking deliberately with a cane, though trying to hide his infirmity as best he could. Alicent walked beside him, serene in her countenance, wearing a gown of dark green that shimmered like an emerald under sunlight. Then came Princess Rhaenyra, escorted by the Kingsguard. Her face was solemn yet resolved, her presence commanding. Every eye in the sept gravitated to her. Moments later, Aegon strode in from the opposite end, meeting her gaze with an expression that hovered between nervousness and a faint grin. As they came to stand before the High Septon, the hush that fell over the crowd was akin to the final quiet before a storm. The High Septon spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the unity of House Targaryen, and the blessings of the Seven upon the couple. In a nod to tradition, their hands were bound together with a ribbon bearing the house sigil, and the Septon poured scented oils over them, invoking the father, the mother, and all other aspects. When he declared them husband and wife, the sept filled with applause. Aegon bent to kiss Rhaenyra, a fleeting, formal thing that carried both a sense of triumph and an undercurrent of tension. Outside, horns rang across King's Landing, fireworks crackled, and the city erupted in cheers. In the sky, two dragons, Syrax and Sunfire, called out in what might have been recognition of this union. For a moment, the world paused in a single breath of possibility. Might this truly mark a new dawn for House Targaryen, or had the seeds of conflict merely been buried deeper? The wedding feast that followed was a lavish affair, even more grand than the betrothal celebration. Many hundreds packed the great hall. Long tables were laden with a bounty of dishes: spiced lobster from Crackclaw Point, rich stews from the Riverlands, lemon cakes from Dorne, succulent roast duck from the Reach, and an array of sweet wines from the Arbor. Minstrels played lively tunes, while jugglers and acrobats entertained between courses. To the small folk allowed in the outer yard, the Red Keep seemed aglow with light and promise. They marveled at the spectacle of Targaryen might, whispering prayers for peace. Within the hall, the conversation was a swirl of alliances, land disputes, and speculation about what heirs Rhaenyra and Aegon might produce. Those who had expected to see open rivalry might have breathed a sigh of relief. At the high table, the newlyweds sat side by side, King Viserys beaming with watery eyes, Queen Alicent offering measured smiles, and Prince Daemon looking on with detached amusement. To the surprise of many, Daemon soon rose from his seat and requested a dance with the princess, now the prince's bride. Music started up again, and the crowd parted to let them dance. It was a spectacle to see Daemon guiding Rhaenyra in steps that had more the air of a waltz from the free cities than the Westerosi tradition. She followed deftly, her gown swirling around her feet. The onlookers watched the interplay of their expressions. Did they share a regret over what might have been? Or was this Daemon's way of accepting Rhaenyra's new path? When the dance ended, Daemon pressed a respectful kiss to his niece's hand, then turned to Aegon. "Nephew," he said, a faintly mocking lilt in his voice, "you have gained the greatest jewel in the realm. See that you treasure her." Aegon nodded stiffly, uncertain how to respond to a man like Daemon, who danced on the edge of courtesy and insolence like a blade. But for that night, there was no challenge, no open hostility. The dance floor filled again with couples eager to join the revel. Soon after, Rhaenyra and Aegon made the ceremonial departure to their private chambers, a custom that always brought on bawdy cheers and good-natured ribaldry from the hall. King Viserys, flush with wine, stood to hail the union, calling it a triumph for House Targaryen. The crowd roared with approval, or at least with the polite form of approval that centuries of feudal tradition demanded. Some toasted the princess, some the prince, and some cheered them both with the cry of "Long may they reign." If any doubted, they kept silent. If any still plotted, they concealed it well behind masks of civility. In the corridors, servants hurried to lay out the wedding bed with fresh linens, scattering rose petals that gave off a sweet fragrance. A hush descended as the newlyweds took their first steps into the bedchamber. The heavy door closed behind them with a resonant thud, leaving the realm's fate sealed, at least for that moment, in that union. In the days following the wedding, it became evident that Rhaenyra meant to maintain a leadership role, no matter her marital status. She continued to meet with key advisors, poring over maps, and sitting beside her father at council meetings. Aegon, for his part, found himself welcomed into the fold as well, sometimes taking a seat at the royal council, learning the intricacies of governance that Rhaenyra had been studying for years. Although some of the older council members questioned his maturity and readiness, none could deny that he had a certain quickness of wit. Still, he was restless, and often drifted off in thought when discussions turned tedious. He preferred listening to rumors of foreign ports or hearing stories from knights returned from campaigns in the Stepstones. Rhaenyra, though determined to keep her father's trust, recognized that forging a genuine partnership with her new husband might take time. They were both proud, used to certain privileges, and carried the expectations of different factions upon their shoulders. Beyond the walls of the keep, changes stirred in the city. The factions that had once identified so strongly as either black or green found less reason to distinguish themselves openly. A wave of cautious optimism spread, though cynics warned that old grudges die hard. Queen Alicent continued to champion her own children's interests in subtle ways, but now she found it more prudent to align herself with Rhaenyra rather than oppose her. Daemon and Helaena, Aegon's siblings, remained in the background, curious to see how the realm adjusted to the princess being both the named heir and the prince's wife. The entire dynamic of the royal family was in flux, rebalancing around this new center, Rhaenyra and Aegon, the future of the Targaryen dynasty. Yet beneath the veneer of unity, tension still flickered like an ember in a fireplace. Daemon had not left King's Landing, although his presence was somewhat subdued. He and Rhaenyra would still speak in private on occasion, presumably about matters of the realm and House Targaryen's future. Rumors began to swirl that Daemon was courting the idea of returning to the Stepstones or forging new alliances elsewhere. None could say for certain. Some wondered if Daemon was content to see Rhaenyra wed to Aegon. Did he harbor resentment, or a cunning plan that might yet unfold? Meanwhile, the lords of Westeros carefully weighed where their loyalties now lay. Lord Bormund Baratheon at Storm's End, who had once staunchly supported Rhaenyra, watched the situation with mild skepticism but withheld any outright dissent. The Lannisters at Casterly Rock sent cordial missives, congratulating the couple but quietly preparing for any eventual disruption. The Vale, strong in its mountainous holdfasts, reaffirmed its loyalty to the crown, acknowledging that the marriage had indeed presented a unified front. In the Reach, House Tyrell nodded along, guided by ancient ties to House Hightower. Perhaps the biggest shift was at Driftmark, seat of House Velaryon. Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, had championed Rhaenyra's claim and had ties to the Targaryens through Laenor and Lena. Now, with Rhaenyra bound to Aegon, he found himself in an ambiguous position. He wanted House Velaryon's interests protected, and only time would tell if that would be the case. For a while, the realm seemed to exhale a collective breath of relief. King Viserys' health stabilized somewhat. The tension that had racked him for years seemed eased by the knowledge that his two competing heirs were now married. Tournaments were held in celebration in the months following the union, with knights from across the realm competing for glory. At one such tournament, Aegon sat beside Rhaenyra, each awarding favor to different justers. The crowd roared at the display as the newlyweds presented a united image. Some knights wore combined colors, black and green entwined, to show their acceptance of the new order. When Ser Criston Cole, once called the Kingmaker, tilted in the lists, the onlookers watched closely. Rumor had it that he was once devoted to Rhaenyra before transferring his loyalty to Alicent and Aegon. Now, with the two branches joined, who truly held Ser Criston's loyalty? The knight's face remained impassive, betraying little, as he unhorsed opponent after opponent with skillful thrusts of his lance. Finally, he approached the royal box, saluted both the prince and princess, and bowed in acknowledgement. The crowd cheered, reading in that gesture some measure of acceptance to the new reality, though the astute recognized that Cole's personal feelings were not so easily mended. In private, Rhaenyra and Aegon grew into a tentative partnership that was more cordial than passionate at first. They learned to converse without constant jabs or pointed remarks, and on some evenings, they dined alone, discussing the day's events. Rhaenyra shared her knowledge of the crown's finances, the shipping lanes, and the import duties that kept King's Landing thriving. Aegon, for his part, brought insights from his close companions and his mother's counsel. He had a sense of which lords were more likely to cause trouble and which might prove allies. Sometimes they disagreed fiercely, one or the other storming off with a scowl. But they always came back to the conversation, guided by a sense of responsibility bigger than their personal pride. Neither wanted to fail King Viserys in his twilight years, and neither wished to be seen as a lesser in the eyes of the realm. Their nights were more complicated. The marriage bed was an obligation they both understood, a means to produce heirs that would strengthen the claim of their branch of House Targaryen. Yet closeness and true intimacy took time. Aegon, young and brash, was sometimes unsure how to navigate Rhaenyra's stronger will. Rhaenyra, older by a few years, found him both exasperating and oddly endearing at times. Their arguments could be sharp, but they also discovered small pockets of laughter, usually when confounded by each other's mannerisms. In those quiet, lamplit hours, they would sometimes speak openly about their fears. She about the burden of rule, he about living in the shadow of her earlier claim. The confessions were not the stuff of epic romance, but they forged an understanding, a piece at a time, that what they shared was a necessary bond for the realm's good. After half a year, the first sign that their union would bear fruit arrived. Rhaenyra realized she was with child. The announcement sent waves of excitement through King's Landing. King Viserys wept with joy upon hearing the news. Alicent offered prayers to the mother for a healthy child. Even Daemon's impassive mask cracked slightly when he heard, though no one could say if it was with genuine happiness or some more complex brew of emotions. The Queen's ladies began to prepare baby clothes, and the maesters readied their potions and knowledge for the pregnancy. Rhaenyra carried herself with the pride of a prospective mother who knew that the child she carried might one day unite the realm as never before. Aegon, for his part, swelled with pride, telling his drinking companions that he would soon have a true Targaryen heir to train and guide. Whispers traveled throughout the Seven Kingdoms. If Rhaenyra bore a son, would that boy be the next undisputed heir to the Iron Throne, bridging both the blacks and the greens? Or if it were a daughter, would the old questions of claim and priority return? As Rhaenyra's belly grew, tensions did not vanish entirely. They merely sought new channels. Alicent, mindful of the position of her other children, made sure that Aemond and Helena continued their studies and training. She reasoned that, in the shifting game of power, anything might happen. If Rhaenyra produced multiple heirs, alliances could be shaped in myriad ways. Some older lords still clung to the notion that a woman should not rule. Others believed that the tradition of Targaryens marrying kin was a sign that the gods would punish them eventually for such incestuous ties. Religious murmurs of discontent flared up in certain corners, though the king's authority kept them largely contained. Daemon, traveling between King's Landing and Dragonstone with some frequency, kept a watchful eye on Rhaenyra's progress. He also took time to speak privately with King Viserys, though few knew what passed between the brothers behind closed doors. As the pregnancy progressed into its final months, all eyes turned to the princess, waiting for the momentous day when she would bring forth a child of combined lineage. A hush of anticipation settled over the Red Keep. Then, at last, the hour came. Rhaenyra's labors began at dawn on a humid summer day. Maesters and midwives bustled about the bedchamber, issuing hushed commands. Queen Alicent was present, although Rhaenyra had also insisted upon having her own chosen attendants, women she trusted, some of whom had served her since youth. The pains of birth were long and grueling, and more than once, the midwives worried. Aegon, outside the chamber, paced anxiously, torn between dread and excitement. King Viserys waited in the throne room, having asked for updates every hour. Daemon lingered in the corridors, offering no outward expression of worry, but his eyes betrayed it when he questioned the guards stationed near the door. After hours that felt like an eternity, the sound of a newborn's cries pierced the hush of the corridors. The door swung open, and the maester emerged, beaming with relief. "A prince," he announced. "The gods have blessed the princess with a healthy prince." Within the chamber, Rhaenyra lay exhausted but triumphant, cradling a tiny, wrinkled infant with a fuzz of pale silver hair. Aegon entered, his eyes shining, and approached the bedside. He gently placed a hand on his son's head. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming flood of pride, joy, and a touch of terror at the responsibility that now rested on both of them. The babe's cry was strong, a sign the maesters took as a good omen. Outside, word spread like wildfire. Rhaenyra had birthed a son. From the streets of King's Landing to the far keeps of the realm, people rejoiced or at least acknowledged that a new Targaryen prince had come into the world. A prince who was the offspring of both the Blacks and the Greens. This, many hoped, would finally secure the future of the dynasty. Viserys, hearing the news, stumbled to his feet, tears streaming. He declared a week of feasting, pardons for certain petty criminals, and donations to the poor. Alicent, tempered by her experiences in childbirth, offered genuine congratulations, taking her new grandson into her arms with a trembling smile. Daemon, looking upon the child, murmured something about the house's Valyrian blood running strong. Targaryen banners were hung from the battlements, and a great bell in the city rang out to mark the birth of a prince. In the Red Keep, the swirl of color and music and celebration reached a fever pitch. It seemed that, for once, the entire realm might rally around a single birth, a single hope. In the following days, the newborn prince was named Viserys, in honor of his grandsire. The king, though weakened by age and illness, held the babe in trembling hands, proclaiming he had never known such happiness. To see a child bearing the combined lineage of his firstborn daughter and his firstborn son filled him with a sense of peace that overcame the pain in his joints and the weariness in his spirit. Courtiers flocked to see the child, to present him with tokens and gifts. Some offered elaborate silver rattles, others commissioned small suits of armor for the day he might ride a dragon. Talk began about which dragon the young prince might bond with, for Targaryen tradition often gave a child an egg in the cradle to see if the connection would spark. And so a glossy black egg, flecked with swirls of gold, was brought forth from the dragon pit, nestled beside Prince Viserys in his cradle. Each morning, Rhaenyra would check on it, half expecting to see cracks forming, though it was early yet. For a stretch of time, the realm breathed easier. Rhaenyra's supporters took the birth as a sign that she and Aegon would secure a stable lineage, removing the cause for any possible civil war over the succession. Aegon's supporters found satisfaction in the fact that their prince had fathered a strong son, ensuring House Targaryen's future from their side of the line. To outward appearances, the Blacks and Greens had become one, symbolized in that tiny babe's cries. King Viserys presided over a grand ceremony in the throne room, presenting the child to the realm's gathered lords and naming him second in line for the throne after Rhaenyra and Aegon. Great cheers resounded, and in that moment, it seemed that all the old rivalries had been eased. But life at court was never so simple. Beneath the surface, new questions arose, questions that might sow the seeds of strife for the future. Alicent quietly wondered if the child would truly be recognized as the rightful heir should anything happen to Rhaenyra and Aegon. Some who favored Aegon still felt a prickle of discontent that Rhaenyra was older and so firmly entrenched in her father's favor. On the other side, those who had championed Rhaenyra worried whether the boy's birth might shift the balance of power in Aegon's favor, eventually marginalizing Rhaenyra herself. But these murmurings were soft, drowned out by the cheers and celebrations of the majority, who simply saw the birth as a reason for hope. Months passed. Prince Viserys grew, his infant coups filling Rhaenyra's chambers with life. Aegon took to fatherhood in fits and starts, sometimes doting on the child, at other times returning late from nights of revelry. Yet he never openly shirked his duties, and Rhaenyra, ever a watchful mother, balanced the demands of the court with her devotion to her son. They settled into a routine that, while not devoid of friction, functioned well enough to keep the peace. Together, they presided over smaller councils, heard petitions, and made visits to the September and the Dragon Pit. King Viserys watched with tired but proud eyes, content that his legacy was secure. It was around this time that the first whisper of trouble came from across the narrow sea. The triarchy was reassembling, threatening the shipping lanes once more. Merchants from Pentos and Bravos arrived in King's Landing, pleading for Targaryen intervention to keep the Stepstones free of pirates and oppressive tolls. The small council debated the appropriate response. Rhaenyra advocated a measured approach, forging alliances with certain free cities to contain the threat. Aegon, restless, advocated for a show of force, citing that Targaryen dragons could end the triarchy's meddling once and for all. Those at the table noted that he was beginning to show glimmers of a fiery temperament. Daemon, when he appeared at the council, had no shortage of opinions. He knew the Stepstones well from his earlier campaigns and believed swift, decisive action was necessary. The conversation quickly became a test of unity between the new generation of Targaryens. Would Rhaenyra and Aegon navigate these waters as one, or would old rivalries resurface? An expedition was eventually authorized, led by seasoned admirals loyal to the crown. Targaryen knights boarded ships under the banner of the dragon, and a small force was dispatched to quell piracy and restore safe passage. Though Aegon was eager to fly Sunfire into battle, King Viserys insisted he remain in King's Landing to continue learning the responsibilities of governance, and to stand with Rhaenyra should the king's health fail. Aegon bristled at the restriction, and Rhaenyra had to soothe his wounded pride by promising that one day they would ride their dragons to victory together. Despite the friction, they presented a united front to the realm, and the expedition seemed to achieve modest success. The triarchy scattered for the moment, leaving trade routes largely untroubled. Back in King's Landing, Daemon grew bored once again. He left the city in search of new adventures, though he did so without creating a stir. Whispers said he might have traveled to Pentos, or perhaps Volantis, forging alliances or deals unknown to the crown. Rhaenyra's heart was unsettled by her uncle's abrupt departure, but she found no just cause to pursue him. So she remained in the Red Keep, fulfilling her duties, raising her infant son, and slowly forging an adult partnership with Aegon that, surprisingly, began to mellow into something akin to respect. Though they might never be star-crossed lovers, they both took the Targaryen name seriously, understanding that they carried the future of their house in their hands. When the next year brought news that Rhaenyra was pregnant again, the court erupted in fresh celebration. The hope was that more children would mean a more secure line, as well as strengthen the bond between husband and wife. In that second pregnancy, Rhaenyra found herself reflecting on everything that had come to pass. She recalled the days before she wed Aegon, when she bristled at the notion of sharing her birthright. She had come a long way from that resentment, discovering that forging a functional alliance within one's own family sometimes demanded compromise and acceptance. Aegon, for his part, matured slightly, though he still chafed at times under Rhaenyra's overshadowing presence. The older lords and ladies at court watched them with veiled scrutiny, noting each small sign of friction or unity, trying to gauge which way the winds might blow if Viserys were to pass. The old king lingered, continuing to preside over a peaceful realm, but his health was undeniably waning. Each day, The Watchers wondered if the next cough or fainting spell would herald a new era. It was in the 5th moon of Rhaenyra's 2nd pregnancy that trouble arrived at the capital's gates in a more tangible form. A contingent of lords from the Riverlands came forward, arguing that certain lands held by the crown under Rhaenyra's name should be relinquished to them, claiming an ancestral right from decades prior. At any other time, this might have been a routine dispute, but some among these lords whispered in the corridors that they mistrusted the unborn child's place in the succession and sought to stake their claims, while the kingdom's attention was focused on Rhaenyra's childbearing. A heated debate erupted in the throne room, culminating in a tense standoff between Aegon and one Lord Rhaenyra, who implied that the Greens had always been the rightful line. Rhaenyra's eyes flashed, and for the first time in months, she felt the old sting of betrayal. Did these lords truly think that her marriage to Aegon changed nothing, that her position was still precarious? King Viserys, ill and confined to his chambers, could not intervene personally. It was Rhaenyra who presided, with Aegon at her side. They questioned the lords carefully, referencing the old records, hearing out each claim. Lord Rhaenyra grew bold, sneering that the child Rhaenyra carried was as yet unborn, so the lords should not stake their fortunes on an uncertainty. A hush fell over the throne room. Slowly, Aegon rose, speaking in a voice that carried a surprising weight. He reminded the gathering that he and Rhaenyra stood as one, by order of their father, the king. Any challenge to her authority was a challenge to his own. Then Rhaenyra spoke, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She declared that the unborn child would share in the Targaryen legacy, that the line of succession was clear and unalterable. Her tone was fierce and resolute, and in that moment, onlookers saw the commanding presence that had led Viserys to name her heir so many years ago. The lords backed down, muttering their discontent but ultimately acceding to the authority of the newlyweds. Word spread throughout the court that Rhaenyra and Aegon had faced down a challenge together, defending the unity they claimed to represent. Another year passed, during which Rhaenyra gave birth to a daughter, named Aelys, who entered the world with a quiet cry but healthy lungs. The joy in the Red Keep doubled. 2 children now, a boy and a girl, each bridging the gap between the once divided factions. King Viserys, frail as he was, lived to see his granddaughter, though he was confined to bed for many of his final days. He would cradle the little princess, humming off-key lullabies while Alicent hovered nearby, worry etched into her features as she watched her husband's slow decline. The realm, for the most part, grew accustomed to the notion that the future lay in the hands of Rhaenyra and Aegon, and that their children would carry forward the Targaryen dominion. If there were still malcontents or would-be usurpers, they kept themselves well hidden. However, the specter of conflict was never fully banished. Murmurs lingered in back halls and distant keeps. Some believed that once Viserys died, the matter of primacy would flare up again, no matter the sibling marriage. Factions can shift as quickly as the wind, and the question of who truly wielded power might well come to a head when the old king was gone. Even among Rhaenyra's sworn allies, there was a certain unease. Her marriage to Aegon had ensured peace so far, but what if the prince's ambitions or the ambitions of his supporters began to override Rhaenyra's authority once she was queen in name? And among Aegon's retinue, some wondered if the older sister-wife might overshadow Aegon, leaving him a figurehead rather than a king in truth. The royal children, small and innocent, remained blissfully ignorant of these looming clouds. In the nursery, they laughed and played with wooden dragon toys, unknowing that the realm pinned its hopes and fears on their tiny shoulders. The fleeting peace gave the 7 kingdoms a chance to prosper. Trade flourished, harvests were adequate, and the roads were relatively secure. Time and again, King Viserys would express gratitude that he had acted when he did. In one of his final coherent conversations with Rhaenyra, he said, "You and Aegon, you have given the realm a chance to avoid the darkest days I once feared. Keep it so, my child. Keep it so." He died in his sleep not long thereafter, and the bells of King's Landing tolled to announce the passing of the king who had ruled for so many years in peace. The entire city donned black in mourning, even as it held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The funeral pyre was lit, with Rhaenyra and Aegon front and center, wearing matching black garments, their children beside them. Dragons soared overhead, roaring their sorrow. When the flames finally died down, a hush lingered over the city. This was the moment many had long dreaded or anticipated. Would the Greens and the Blacks truly remain united? The answer came the following day, when the small council gathered. Rhaenyra, eldest child of the late king, was crowned as Rhaenyra Targaryen, queen of the Undulls, the Rhaenyra, and the First Men. Aegon was also crowned at her side, a twist that might have caused uproar if not for the fact that their marriage had been established as a unifying force. Thus, in the throne room, before the assembled lords and ladies, the High Septon placed one crown upon Rhaenyra's head and another upon Aegon's. It was a remarkable sight. Co-monarchs, siblings, each holding the Targaryen name, each representing a once-divided faction. The crowd cheered with surprising gusto, sensing that the realm was witnessing something unprecedented. Of course, behind the scenes, the lines of authority might be more complex, but in that ceremonial moment, the realm saw two heads of the dragon upon the same throne, or at least upon the same dais. Queen Alicent, veiled in mourning, watched her son and stepdaughter ascend to power. Tears glistened in her eyes, though whether they were from grief, relief, or a mixture of both, none could say. Daemon, returning from his travels, stood with arms crossed, a faint smile on his lips, though some said they glimpsed dissatisfaction behind his eyes. Corlys Velaryon bent the knee, acknowledging the new order. The lords of the realm, one by one, knelt and vowed fealty to the twin monarchs. Notably absent was any audible dissent. This was the moment the marriage had been intended to create. A singular front, a united crown. For the realm, it promised continued peace, a respite from the horrors that might have been. For House Targaryen, it was a demonstration that even the seeds of bitter rivalry could be grafted together under the right conditions. And so began the reign of Rhaenyra and Aegon Targaryen, co-rulers of Westeros. In the first weeks, they held court together, receiving envoys from Dorne, the Iron Islands, and beyond. They listened to pleas, settled disputes, and worked to cement their authority. Rhaenyra took the lead on certain matters. Her knowledge of the realm's intricacies was unmatched, while Aegon emerged as a strong voice in military and diplomatic ventures. Together, they sought to emulate the best of their father's reign while forging a distinct legacy of their own. The memory of how close the realm had come to civil war lingered in their minds, driving them to keep a tight grip on any signs of discord. Yet the story did not end there, for history has a way of complicating even the best-laid plans. As their reign continued, challenges arose from without and within. Pirates tested the borders, lords with old grudges schemed, and the faith quietly murmured its discomfort with the sibling marriage. Each crisis required delicate handling, but the fact remained that with the birth of their children, with the unification of their houses, and with the symbolic crowning of both, the Targaryens had, at least for the moment, averted the cataclysmic war that King Viserys had so dreaded. Rhaenyra and Aegon's marriage, once viewed with suspicion, became the bedrock of a new era, an era that might yet be undone by pride, ambition, or betrayal, but which, for the time being, gave the Seven Kingdoms hope. In the years that followed, the small folk would look back upon the wedding of Rhaenyra and Aegon with a mix of fascination and gratitude. Ballads were written praising the wisdom of King Viserys, who had seen a path to peace in the face of nearly certain war. Mummers' plays dramatized the tense betrothal feast, the regal wedding, and the miraculous birth of Prince Viserys, depicting Rhaenyra and Aegon as star-crossed in a sense, yet destined to save the realm from dragonfire and bloodshed. The truth, as always, was more complicated, involving rivalries set aside under the threat of mutual destruction. But in stories and songs, the complexities faded, leaving only the image of a house that overcame itself, merging two claimants into one throne. For Rhaenyra and Aegon, the challenges of ruling together never fully disappeared. They navigated personal disagreements, differences in leadership style, and the undercurrents of factional loyalty that persisted at court. At times, Aegon's temper flared; at others, Rhaenyra's commanding nature chafed at him. But they had children who reflected them both, and that gave them a powerful reason to find common ground. Those children were the future of House Targaryen, silver-haired babes who would grow up knowing that they were descended from a line that had once been on the brink of tearing itself apart. If the realm was lucky, they would be raised to value unity over division. In quieter moments, Rhaenyra would recall the times she had walked the corridors of the Red Keep as a girl, believing she would rule alone one day. She had never anticipated sharing her crown. And yet, here she was, a queen in her own right, but also a wife to a king who was both her half-brother and her equal in the eyes of the realm. She discovered a resilience in herself that she had not known before, an ability to bend without breaking. Aegon, too, found that he could be more than the second-born, overshadowed by his sister. He could be a partner in rule, forging a legacy of his own design, recognized by the realm not merely as a usurper in waiting but as a king crowned legitimately at his father's decree. Their marriage, begun as a political bargain to avert disaster, evolved into a collaboration that, if not exactly love, was at least respect and alliance. Over time, genuine affection grew, perhaps not the fiery passion of romances told in ballads, but a bond tempered by shared trials and parental pride. One day, deep into their reign, an incident arose that tested their unity once more. A rogue dragon, unclaimed for years, was said to have made its lair near the coast of Crackclaw Point, terrorizing small folk in the region. Rhaenyra, by then seasoned in dealing with threats, decided to investigate personally, to ensure that the realm understood the crown would not stand idle. Aegon insisted on accompanying her. Together, astride Syrax and Sunfire, they took flight, leading a small retinue of dragon riders. The sight of two Targaryen monarchs in the sky, their dragon's wings blotting out the sun, stirred a mixture of awe and fear in the small folk below. The rogue dragon, an old, scarred beast from a previous generation, proved elusive but eventually revealed itself. With coordinated precision, Rhaenyra and Aegon managed to corner the creature, offering it a choice: submit to the will of House Targaryen or be destroyed. The encounter was tense, the dragons roaring at one another in a primal language of fire and fury. But in the end, the rogue dragon backed down, though it would not accept a rider. The spectacle of Rhaenyra and Aegon controlling the skies, however, left an indelible impression on all who witnessed it. The monarchy was not divided, for two dragons soared as one. When they returned to the Red Keep, triumphant, the court heaped praise upon them, calling them the two-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Jesters cracked jokes about the possibility of them breathing fire in tandem, while minstrels composed new verses hailing the synergy of Syrax and Sunfire. For a moment, Rhaenyra and Aegon looked at each other, not as reluctant partners, but as co-rulers who had found a way to work in harmony. It was fleeting, as all such moments are, but it echoed the promise King Viserys had seen in that union so many years ago. Perhaps House Targaryen could transcend its own rivalries. Perhaps the dream of peace was not so far-fetched. Of course, no reign is eternal, and no story halts abruptly in a neat resolution. There would be further disagreements, fresh plots, external threats, internal resentments. Yet the marriage that many had mocked or feared became the pivot on which the realm's fortune turned. History might record it as a masterstroke or as a gamble that narrowly succeeded. Bards sang of it as a romance, while learned maesters described it as a calculated necessity. But to the people who lived under it, the important thing was that dragon fought not dragon, and that the fields did not burn. The Seven Kingdoms did not drown in blood. In the annals of House Targaryen, the question, what if Rhaenyra had married Aegon II to unite the Greens and the Blacks, found its answer in the forging of a precarious peace, in the birth of heirs who carried both lines forward, and in the creation of a dual monarchy that defied tradition yet somehow sustained itself. Perhaps the cautionary lesson was that unity must be continually nurtured, that even the greatest of houses can crack under pressure if old wounds are left untended. Or perhaps it was that the power of dragons could be best harnessed when its wielders learned to compromise with each other rather than turn that power inward in a blaze of civil strife. For generations afterward, the monarchy of Rhaenyra and Aegon would serve as a point of reference. Some would idealize it, others would pick apart its flaws. But the crucial truth remained. In a time when it seemed the Targaryens were destined to tear themselves apart, they found a way, through marriage, through children, through shared rule, to hold the 7 kingdoms together. And that, in the eyes of the maesters who compiled the histories, was a small miracle, a testament to what might happen when pride yielded, if only a little, to the greater good. Yet whispers persisted among those who studied the deeper lore of the Targaryens, who knew of prophecies and dreams that foretold darkness from the north. Was it not Rhaenyra's father who believed so fiercely in the prophecy passed down from Aegon the Conqueror? A song of ice and fire, they called it, a vision of an enemy beyond the wall of ice. Some said that if House Targaryen fractured, the realm would be doomed when that threat finally emerged. Perhaps that knowledge, that deeper sense of purpose, was the invisible string binding Rhaenyra and Aegon together as they navigated the labyrinth of politics and pride. Whether the threat was real or myth, the belief in it shaped the Targaryen sense of destiny. And so, in that alternate turning of the wheel of fate, Rhaenyra Targaryen and Aegon Targaryen reigned with both hope and caution, forging a path different from the one that might have ended in dragonfire and betrayal. Their children grew into the realm's future, each of them inheriting a piece of their parents' nature: courage and stubbornness, ambition and empathy, bloodlines that might yet carry the realm into further triumphs or tragedies. But for now, the realm knew an era of stability and the image of 2 Targaryen monarchs, once destined for rivalry, standing side by side upon the Iron Throne, stood as proof that even the gods might be swayed by those determined to find unity in a house once divided.